Hey, Mr. Landis here. Our final lesson of the Civil War, lesson 8. Here we go. We're talking about the human cost. What was the physical and social cost of the Civil War? By physical, I'm talking about humans as well as landscape, and by social cost, I'm talking about the idea of how do people react and why do these people react that way to the loss and the destruction and the devastation during a war, and also what falls after, how that sets them up for things like reunification. Here's what we're going to find. The Civil War killed more Americans than any other war. We know that. But the destruction of the southern landscape, this is key, and the southern population at a much higher degree made reunification very difficult. In fact, the seeds of the human cost and physical cost of this war lead to the social cost and the political things that we'll see later during Reconstruction and why it was such a failure. I shouldn't say very easy. It's easier to defeat an enemy in war than it is to convince them that the ideals with which you fought for are worthy things for them to change to. We're going to see after the war, sadly, the South digs its heels in even more. Hence things like the KKK. All right, let's dive into the numbers. Very familiar chart. This is from the Civil War Trust. We're going to talk about the numbers in a second. You see here that the American Civil War is, without a shadow of a doubt, the deadliest war we fought. Now, there's a couple of reasons that's obvious. Number one, we were fighting each other, right? Of course, duh. The second reason, though, because you have to look at population, the second reason is because the weapons of the time, remember we said, were so advanced, were more advanced than the tactics of the time. So old tactics plus new weapons equals insane, bloody carnage. Rifles that go 300 yards, and yet we're marching at each other up to 30 feet. Terrible, terrible. So we know why. Old tactics, new weapons. Now, let's talk about the cost. The numbers of the cost, this 620,000 number, was developed by two Civil War veterans at the end of the 1800s named Fox and Livermore. And they largely, most people acknowledged it was an estimate. It was very difficult to get those numbers. Civil War historians for the 100 years after took this number, and while many acknowledged that it probably wasn't exact, they used it and relied on it as the figure that was known. Until this guy, Professor David Hacker from Binghamton University, came up with a really cool way of researching mortality from the Civil War using this double census data idea, which is pretty cool. And he came out with a study that said, really, guys, the number is really as high as probably 850,000. He settled on 750,000 for his estimate, and here's what he said. About half the men killed in the battles were buried without identification. Most records were geared toward determining group strength. So this idea that we can't necessarily rely on the records of the generals and the officers, because much of that was geared to report lower numbers, which in turn had the death toll lower than it actually was. So here's the number he settled on. We're going to use the Fox and Livermore number for the remainder of some of the explorations, but know that the number is likely as high as 850,000. But the number that most historians, by the way, agreed with, some of the bigwigs like Dr. Foner, agreed with Professor Hacker, around 750,000. Okay, so here's the chart that I want to start with. Look at the numbers here. We know the disease was the deadliest, but if you look at total death, here we have, I'm going to break it down. This is the Fox and Livermore kind of basic assumption. So the North clearly lost more people than the South. Now this makes sense because remember Grant's tactics, attrition war. We have more to expend, therefore we can and we will win. That leads to more deaths. We know that. Now here's why this matters though from a population standpoint. Here's why the physical cost creates a social cost. Look at this number. Okay. The population of the North is about 22 million. If you do your factoring here, what happens to the population loss is this. This is about 1.5% of the population is lost. Staggering number, okay? You do those numbers today, we'll talk about that in a second. Now the South loses, remember there's about 5 million free citizens. I'm not including the slave number there because they didn't consider them to be humans and citizens, so let's exclude them. That is about 5.2%. That is a multiple of 5. That is crazy. 5 times as many people were lost in the South per population. Okay, now it gets even worse. Look at the male population. If we can assume that half of the population is male, which statistically it probably was, that number of the North comes down to 11 million. So the North loses 3%. Okay, 3% is male population. If you do that number in the South, you're down to 2.5 million. That number comes out to, my face is in the way, it is 10.4% of the population. That is staggering, okay? You need to think about what that means for a society that is missing 1 out of every 10 men. Staggering, okay? Think about that as a social cost. Some other charts I want to look at with you by the Civil War Trust. You've got death by state. This is important. Think about what states might have a harder time recovering because their population loss was greater. Look at Virginia. Look at North Carolina, South Carolina, right? Alabama. These states lost a significantly more number of men than other states. Therefore, those communities have fewer people returning, fewer people to farm, fewer people to marry, fewer people to be fathers and brothers and husbands and friends. This is a significant issue in the social healing and the physical healing of the South, not to mention the landscape. I'm not trying to discount the loss of the North, who arguably is, if you think about, we're not talking about heroes and villains here, but we're talking about the loss of the North was greater in terms of number, right? Look at these states: Illinois, Indiana, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, right? African American soldiers are going to die at a tremendously greater level of disease because of, right, most of their work effort is being not necessarily in combat. It's not to discount the Union death. It's to say that the social fabric of the North, because they won and because they lost fewer people in the population, and by the way, their landscape was not destroyed by Sherman, they had a significantly easier time recovering, okay, socially, emotionally, economically. I want to end with this. This is a really important chart to think about too, to hammer home this point about the social cost. Just again, some math. What you're looking at here is the number of Confederates who served. So this is about 1 million. And then the light tan is those who served and were not wounded, captured, or killed. So this is a casualty comparison. So I did some math here for you. If you take the number of Confederates total who served, about 1 million, over those who were killed, wounded, missing, right, 490,000. That is about a 49% casualty rate. That is staggering. Staggering, okay? In other words, if you were a Confederate soldier, and based upon these numbers, and you went off to fight, chances are 1 in 2, 1 out of 2, 50%, that you either killed, wounded, or missing. In other words, you're not coming home the same. Now, what about the North? Let's look at the numbers. About 2 million who served, casualty rate of that, right? Look at the number, right? 596,000, okay? What does that mean? Right, about a 20. You can't see my face again. About 28%. 28%. That is a significantly lower amount of soldiers who are coming home unchanged. This matters for the social impact and the physical and the healing of the war. Again, we're not even talking about the landscape that is torn up, the economy that is upended, and oh wait, by the second, 4 million African Americans who are now raised to equality, which is of course the great fear of the South, which led them to secede. So our question is, what was the physical and social cost of the Civil War? Here we see the Civil War killed more Americans than any other war. We know old tactics, new weapons, plus we were fighting each other. But the destruction of the southern landscape and the population at a far greater rate made reunification very difficult, right? This isn't about whose fault or who did what. If America's to be united, Lincoln understood this. It's now time to look at them as brothers and sisters again. The problem is, the South has to deal with harder consequences. Political equality for former slaves, racial change, an economy that is completely upended, right? A landscape that is burnt, in some places literally, a human male population that is not present, so that's grief and loss. That is going to make reunification and reemergence and really the seed of Reconstruction a failure from the start. And we're going to see that in our next unit. See you later.